She inherited the house and was cleaning out an old cabinet in her grandfather's room. But what she found behind it made her call 911. She had no idea what this house had been hiding all these years. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Emily Harris did not immediately recognize the envelope when she pulled it from her mailbox on a gray Thursday afternoon. It was sandwiched between a grocery store flyer and a bank statement, hardly standing out except for its soft cream color and the odd heaviness of the paper. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the thickness, the faint texture of something old-fashioned, almost ceremonial. There was no corporate logo, no windowed panel, no indication that it belonged to the endless stream of bills or automated notices she usually received. Only her name, written in careful cursive, the kind no one used anymore, unless they were elderly or deliberately formal. For a moment she considered tossing it onto the kitchen counter to open later, but something in the ink, the slight tremor in the lettering, made her pause. Emily sat down at the table, pushed aside her laptop, and slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of parchment-colored paper, embossed with the seal of a notary office in Ashford Hill, a small city 2 hours from where she lived. The letter was brief and to the point, but its meaning unfolded in her mind with the slow, unsettling weight of a dream. Her grandfather's estate, long forgotten, long unspoken of, long buried beneath decades of family silence, had been reopened. And she, for reasons the letter did not explain, was the named heir. She read the lines again, thinking it must be some mistake. Robert Harris had died when she was barely 12. She remembered the funeral, a closed casket, a priest speaking in quick monotone phrases, her father and uncle whispering harshly near the entrance, as if arguing about something they would never say aloud. She remembered her grandmother's gray, tense face, the way she brushed Emily's hair and told her in a strained voice that her grandfather was a complicated man, but he loved you. But this house, had never been mentioned again. Emily leaned back, feeling the quiet chill of her apartment press in around her. At 45, she had built a life entirely separate from her childhood. A modest townhouse, a job managing logistics for a distribution company, a handful of friends she saw occasionally but not often. Her days moved on Rail's commute, work, grocery store, streaming shows, laundry, sleep. The envelope lay on the table like an intruder, something that didn't belong to the predictable orbit she inhabited. She reread the final line of the letter. You are requested to appear at our office to receive the keys and finalize the transfer of property. Property? Estate? Inheritance? Words that sounded almost antique. Her phone buzzed on the counter, but she ignored it. Instead, she gazed at the letter, at the steady curve of the letters forming her name, and for the first time in years, wondered about the man her family had worked so hard to erase. The next week came quickly. Emily made the drive on a muted morning when the sky looked smeared with pale clouds and the road stretched forward in long, empty lanes. Ashford Hill was not a city she had visited in years, though she remembered passing through it on childhood trips. Its old brick buildings, the clock tower, the sense that time there moved more slowly. She parked in front of the notary's office, an old sandstone building with tall windows and a brass plaque beside the door. The air smelled faintly of rain and exhaust fumes, and she felt her stomach tighten as she pushed open the door. Inside, the lobby was quiet. A receptionist directed her to the back office, where a man rose from behind a desk stacked with folders. He introduced himself as Daniel Morris. Middle-aged, with thinning hair and eyes that looked as though they had seen too many secrets and not enough sunlight, he greeted her with a handshake that was both firm and oddly solemn. He motioned for her to sit and opened a slim file with her name on it. "Miss Harris," he began, clearing his throat. "I'm sure this all comes as a surprise." "That's one word for it," she replied, folding her hands together to keep them steady. "I didn't even know there was anything left to inherit." Daniel hesitated, as if measuring what he should say. "Your grandfather was a private man. Very private. His estate has been legally sealed for decades. The terms of his will stipulated that the contents could only be released once certain conditions were met." "What conditions?" Emily asked. Daniel closed the folder slowly. "That part wasn't disclosed to us. We received authorization only last month. What matters now is that everything belonging to the property house, land, contents, has passed fully to you." He reached down and placed a small, sturdy box on the table between them. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay 2 heavy iron keys. They looked old enough to belong in a museum-long shafts, intricate bows, darkened metal worn smooth from use. Emily stared at them. "These open the house?" "They open the gates and the front door," Daniel said. "There are more conventional locks as well, of course. Your grandfather insisted on keeping the originals functional." There was something in his voice, an undertone, like a suppressed instinct to warn her. Emily leaned forward. "Is there something I should know about the house?" Daniel's expression tightened. His eyes flickered to the window and back. "It is an unusual place, not unsafe," he added quickly, though the reassurance rang hollow. "Just untouched. Preserved. Your grandfather rarely allowed anyone to make changes or enter certain parts of the home. You will see for yourself." She waited for him to continue, but he didn't. Instead, he closed the file, slid it toward her, and said, "Everything you need is documented there. The taxes are decades overdue, but that can be corrected easily. You'll also find the deed." Emily took the file, feeling the weight of paper heavier than it should have been, as though it carried more than ink and signatures. The keys lay in her palm like cold stones. As she stepped outside into the pale morning light, the hairs on the back of her neck rose with a strange, inexplicable sensation, something between dread and curiosity. The drive to the property took her beyond the outskirts of the city, past warehouses and abandoned factories, out toward the forested edges where the land sloped and grew wilder. The road narrowed into gravel, then into a cracked stretch of pavement that seemed barely maintained. At last, she saw the gates. Tall wrought iron, knotted with rust and vines, with the Harris crest welded into the center. She recognized it from an old photo album, 3 intersecting lines forming a shield. She stopped the car and stepped out, the air carrying the scent of pine and damp leaves. When she pressed the first key into the lock, the mechanism groaned in protest, but yielded. The gate swung open slowly, almost reluctantly. The driveway was overgrown, the gravel scattered like bones beneath weeds and fallen branches. Trees arched overhead, forming a tunnel of shadow even though it was only early afternoon. As she drove forward, she felt the strange, prickling sensation deepen, as though she were entering a place that remembered things she did not. Then the house came into view. It rose from the clearing in stern lines of brick and stone, 3 stories tall, capped with steep slate roofs. 2 narrow towers stood at the ends like sentinels. Most windows were intact, though darkened, reflecting the pale sky with an eerie stillness. The front porch sprawled wide, its wooden boards weathered, but solid. The whole structure had the heavy, unyielding presence of something built to withstand decades and secrets. Emily turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, studying the home she had never been allowed to approach as a child. Her father had always said it was unsafe, that the place was falling apart, though now she saw he had either lied or exaggerated. The house was neglected, yes, but not ruined. It was preserved, much like the keys, much like the sealed will. She climbed the stairs, each board creaking under her weight. The second iron key slid into the lock, and with a deep, echoing click, the door opened. Darkness spilled toward her like an exhale. She took a breath, stepped inside, and was swallowed by the stillness. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of old books. Her footsteps were muffled by a carpet that had once been grand, but was now threadbare. A chandelier hung above her, coated in grime, its crystals dimmed. Light slanted through narrow windows, illuminating floating specks of dust. And then she saw it. The object that, even without knowing why, she felt the entire house revolved around. A tall, intricately carved wooden cabinet stood in the center of the great hall, positioned with almost ritualistic precision. It was the kind of antique found in museums, heavy, ornate, built from dark walnut. Its doors were shut, but the top drawer sat slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it minutes before she arrived. Emily stepped toward it, feeling the temperature drop slightly as she approached. Her fingers hovered over the carving, twisting vines, small hidden faces, patterns that drew the eye inward. Without meaning to, she glanced behind her, half expecting someone to watch her from the shadows. The house was silent, and yet she felt something. Not a presence, exactly, but an awareness. As if the cabinet was not merely a piece of furniture, but a sentinel guarding something behind it or within it. The rest of the house was a maze of abandoned rooms, a dining hall with a table long enough for a dozen guests, a library with empty shelves, a study whose windows were covered with yellowing curtains. But nothing unsettled her more than the cabinet. Every time she turned a corner or entered another room, the memory of it pulled her back, like a thread tied around her ribs. By the time she left the house at dusk, locking the door behind her, she felt drained and strangely restless. The silhouette of the mansion rose behind her as she drove away, its windows catching the last light of the day like watchful eyes. Emily didn't sleep well that night. She lay awake in the motel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail. The feel of the keys, the cold air in the hall, the slightly open drawer, the way the cabinet seemed both out of place and exactly where it was meant to be. Something was waiting in that house, something that had been sealed away long before she was born. And though fear pressed at her, curiosity was already stronger. She would return. And that decision, the simple act of choosing to come back, would become the first step into a truth her family had spent decades trying to bury. Emily awoke before dawn the next morning, long before her alarm was set to ring. The motel room was dim and quiet, the pale glow of the street lamp outside filtering weakly through the curtains. She lay still for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the radiator and the occasional distant car passing along the highway. But what kept her eyes open and her body tense was not the unfamiliarity of the room. It was the memory of the cabinet in the great hall. Even in the muted half-light, she could see it in her mind, as clearly as if she were standing in front of it. The carved wooden vines, the unevenly opened drawer, the strange chill in the air. It was as if the cabinet had been waiting for her, the same way the house had been waiting for someone to return, someone willing to see what others had refused to confront. She sat up slowly, rubbing her hands over her face. Sleep had not granted her rest. Each time she had drifted into a dream, she found herself walking down the same hallway, the sound of her own footsteps echoing around her until she reached the cabinet. In the dream, she always reached for the drawer. But just when she was about to open it, a deep, hollow knock sounded from inside the wood, reverberating like a heartbeat, and she would jolt awake with her breath caught in her throat. It happened 3 times before she finally gave up on rest entirely. By 7 o'clock, she was already in her car, heading back toward the estate. The sky was washed in pale pinks and blues, a fragile dawn that seemed hesitant to brighten fully. The closer she got to the house, the more a sense of cold clarity settled over her. Fear wrapped tight around determination, like a knot pulled too hard to undo. She needed to understand what her grandfather had left for her to find. She needed to see what was hidden behind that wood and silence. When she passed the rusted iron gates and began driving up the long, overgrown driveway, she felt the same prickle along her arms she had felt the day before. The house emerged through the trees, with its solemn windows and steep roofs, untouched by time, except for the gentle decay of neglect. It stood like a monument to something long dead, yet somehow still breathing. The renovation crew arrived soon after she did, their trucks rattling up the driveway, tires crunching over gravel and fallen branches. They greeted her politely, but she noticed something shift in their expressions the moment they stepped inside the house. Men who had laughed easily minutes before now moved with unease, their eyes darting here and there, as though expecting something to lurch from the shadows. The great hall, with its high ceiling and heavy air, seemed to swallow their voices, and when they noticed the cabinet standing in its peculiar position, they gave it a berth far wider than necessary. One of the workers muttered under his breath, but Emily caught the whispered phrase, "That thing. I swear it wasn't that close to the window yesterday." Another responded sharply, telling him not to start with nonsense. But even he did not come any closer than 20 feet. Emily did not understand their reactions. The cabinet was just furniture, unsettling in its presence, yes, but still wood and metal and the dust of time. She approached it alone. When she reached out to touch the side, the wood felt cold, almost refrigerated. She snatched her hand back, startled by the temperature. It made no sense. The house was cool, but not icy. Nothing else felt like that. "You all right, ma'am?" one of the workers called from across the hall. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice came out quieter than she intended. She tried to push aside her discomfort. The workers went about their tasks, measuring windows, discussing repairs to the roof, debating the state of the wiring. But their attention continued to stray back to the cabinet, as if it were a wild animal, liable to lash out. Emily shook off the tension rising in her, telling herself she was reading too much into their unease. It was only when she heard the faint tapping sound, barely audible over the murmur of voices, that her breath caught. She turned her head sharply. The tapping had come from behind her, from the cabinet. At first she thought she had imagined it, or perhaps a worker had knocked something with his tools, but then it came again, soft but firm, like knuckles lightly rapping wood from the inside. She moved toward the sound instinctively, but one of the workers stepped forward and grabbed her arm gently. "Ma'am," he said in a low tone, "I've been doing home restorations for 30 years. I've heard foundations buckle, walls shift, pipes groan. That wasn't the house talking." She stared at him, her pulse thudding in her ears. Then what was it? The man shook his head. "Don't ask me. Just don't go near it alone." But that was exactly what she intended to do. By mid-afternoon, after delegating tasks and answering a dozen questions from the workers, Emily returned to the cabinet. She waited until the sound of hammers and saws echoed from the far side of the house, then knelt down in front of the lowest drawer. For a moment she didn't move. Her fingers hovered over the drawer handle. Nothing happened. The wood was silent. She exhaled unevenly and pulled the drawer open. Inside was nothing but dust, a few curled scraps of paper, and an old nail that had fallen loose from somewhere. She sifted through it all, but found nothing that explained the odd noise. Her attention shifted upward to the slightly open top drawer, the one she had seen yesterday. Emily stood and reached for it. It moved forward with ease, gliding silently over unseen rails. Inside lay only a small, folded scrap of fabric, stained, brittle, and barely recognizable. But what caught her attention was the gap at the back. The wooden panel behind the drawer had a hairline crack running down its center, and when she pressed her fingers against it, the wood gave slightly, almost as though it had been nailed in place long after the cabinet was built. Her pulse quickened. She pulled the drawer out completely, set it aside, and leaned into the cabinet to inspect the panel. The wood grain did not match the rest of the structure. It looked newer, only a few decades old perhaps, while the cabinet itself belonged to a much earlier period. Her grandfather had lived in this house most of his life. Had he tampered with it? And if so, why? The answer seemed obvious the more she looked at it. The cabinet was not standing there as a decorative centerpiece. It had been placed there for a purpose. It concealed something. She struggled with the panel, working a finger under the edge until a splinter broke away. The sound of footsteps startled her. One of the workers was approaching. Emily quickly stepped aside and pretended to be examining the carvings. When the man passed without questioning her, she returned to her task with renewed urgency. Finally, with a loud crack, the panel snapped loose. Cold air washed out from the dark space behind it. Emily leaned closer, her breath halting as she realized what she was looking at. Behind the false panel was not the expected hollow space of a cabinet, but a wall, a brick wall, built with such haste that the mortar was uneven, smeared, and cracked. The bricks differed in color from the house's original masonry. Someone had erected this barrier deliberately, quickly, and with the intent to hide whatever lay behind it. A chill prickled down her spine. She remembered the letter, the keys, the notary's uneasy tone, her grandfather's sealed will. She ran her fingers lightly across the bricks, and dust crumbled away under her touch. Her heart began to race, as if tuning itself to the same rhythm as the house. She knew what she had to do. The workers packed up early that afternoon, when a sudden rainstorm darkened the sky. By the time their trucks disappeared down the driveway, the estate was washed in a cold, dim light. Emily retrieved a hammer and a small chisel from the toolkit in her car, then returned to the great hall. The cabinet loomed in the silence, its open drawers like hollow eyes staring into the darkness. She slid the tools into the cavity behind the panel and struck the first brick. The blow echoed through the hall, loud enough to make her flinch, but no one was there to hear it except the empty air. She struck again, harder this time, and the mortar cracked. Dust rained onto her arms. The bricks began to loosen. With each strike, she felt both terror and release. Terror at what might be waiting behind the wall. Release at the thought that she was finally uncovering something her family had tried so hard to conceal. The wall gave way slowly, painfully, as though resisting exposure. The first brick fell out, then the second, then a cluster of them tumbled to the floor with a muffled thud. Behind them was darkness, still and stale, and a faint metallic tang in the air that reminded her of old coins. She widened the opening, working feverishly until she could crouch down and peer inside. A narrow passage stretched beyond, just tall enough for her to crawl through. The walls were close, almost claustrophobically so, lined with rough stone that looked older than the rest of the house. She held up her flashlight and saw the passage ended several feet ahead, where a wooden door sat waiting. Its surface cracked and warped with age, its hinges rusted. The air inside the passage was dead and cold. Emily hesitated only a moment before she squeezed herself through the jagged opening. Her shoulders brushed against stone, leaving streaks of dust across her jacket. The light of the great hall faded behind her as she moved forward. Each step made her acutely aware of how alone she was in this house, how quickly everything could shift from the strange curiosity of inherited property to something far darker. When she reached the door, she touched the iron latch and felt it crumble slightly beneath her fingers. Whatever was behind this door had not seen daylight in years, perhaps decades. She drew a deep breath and pushed. The wood groaned, then gave way with a long, protesting creak that seemed almost like a sigh. What she saw inside stole her breath. The hidden chamber was small, barely the size of a storage room, but every surface was covered with objects from another time. Shelves lined with notebooks whose spines were cracked and discolored. Boxes filled with papers, maps, letters. A table piled with loose sheets, some yellowed to a deep amber, others torn or water-stained. A chair sat pulled slightly away from the table, as though someone had risen from it in haste or intended to return. Dust blanketed everything so thickly it softened the edges of the objects, but the room felt strangely untouched, as though preserved by the house itself. Emily moved inside, her step slow and reverent, her flashlight beam catching motes of dust that danced in the stale air. On the table lay a leather-bound journal, open as if waiting for her. She approached it, drawn to its worn cover, and the initials pressed into the front. R. H. Her pulse quickened. She touched the pages gently, surprised to find that the ink, though faded, was still legible. As she read the first lines, a chill wrapped around her spine. It was her grandfather's handwriting. He had written about names she recognized, politicians, businessmen, leaders of the city whom she had grown up hearing about. But the way he wrote about them was nothing like the stories told in newspapers or civic ceremonies. His words were filled with suspicion, urgency, fear. He wrote of late-night meetings, whispered conversations, envelopes exchanged under cover of darkness. He wrote of people who vanished, of investigations that were halted before they began, of threats delivered in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Emily turned the pages slowly, her mind fighting to reconcile the quiet, distant man she remembered with the person who had written these desperate notes. She remembered him as someone who spoke little, who always seemed to be watching the world with cautious eyes. Now she understood why. The deeper she read, the more she felt the room closing in around her. It was as though her grandfather's presence clung to the walls, his unfinished work pressing against her, urging her to continue. And then she found the line that made her breath hitch. If something happens to me, the truth must survive. Emily is the one who will know what to do. Her name, written decades ago, long before she had grown into the woman she was now. She felt her knees weaken and lowered herself into the chair. Her fingers trembled as she traced the letters. She could not understand how her grandfather had known. What had he expected of her? How could he have predicted that she would inherit any of this? A sound echoed faintly behind her, a muffled, distant thud, as if something had shifted in the great hall. She froze, listening. The house was silent again, but fear crept slowly along her skin, a cold whisper telling her she was no longer alone. She extinguished the thought, telling herself the sound had been nothing more than settling wood. She returned to the journal, though the words now seemed heavier, as though aware that she was reading them with the door opened behind her, the house breathing again after being sealed for so long. The room offered more secrets than she could absorb in one night. She found boxes of newspaper clippings, each with notes scribbled in the margins, photographs tucked between pages, showing men in dark coats speaking beside carriages, exchanging envelopes, lingering near alleyways. Maps with circled locations, warehouses, private estates, docks by the river. Letters addressed to journalists and attorneys, never mailed. Her grandfather had collected everything. He had been preparing for something, or terrified of something, or perhaps both. He had built a case so dangerous he had chosen to bury it behind a false cabinet and brick wall. Emily lost track of time as she sifted through the past. When her flashlight dimmed and began to flicker, she realized hours had passed. Reluctantly, she closed the journal and left it on the table exactly where she had found it. The chair creaked as she stood. She backed out of the chamber, feeling the weight of knowledge pressing on her chest. When she stepped into the great hall again, the cabinet stood silently before her, its drawers still open like expectant mouths. She stared at her reflection in the glass door of one of the higher compartments, startled by how tired and pale she looked. Dust smeared her sleeves and hair. But what unsettled her most was how different her eyes seemed. Wider, darker, as though they had already seen too much. She had uncovered the first secret of the house, but she knew instinctively, in the same way she could sense a coming storm before the first rumble of thunder, that this was only the beginning. Whatever her grandfather had hidden had already started to seep into her life, into her thoughts, into the quiet corners of the estate that stirred at night. As she stepped outside into the evening air, she noticed the old iron gate had not fully closed after the workers left. She walked toward it to shut it properly, but halted when she spotted tire tracks she did not recognize. Fresh ones, still damp from the recent rain. Emily turned slowly toward the road, her heart thudding. Far beyond the trees, near the curve of the driveway, she thought she saw a dark sedan parked between the trunks. But when she blinked, the space looked empty. Perhaps it had been a trick of the fading light. Perhaps her mind was still saturated with her grandfather's notes, her imagination steeped in the paranoia written in looping ink. But when she climbed into her car and glanced in the rearview mirror, she thought she saw something shift between the trees, a glint of reflected glass, like headlights backing away into the woods. She tried to tell herself it meant nothing, that she was exhausted, overwhelmed, and thinking too much like the frightened man who had written those journals. But even as she drove back to the motel, she felt the unease settle in her bones. Someone knew she was there. Someone knew she had opened the wall. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she was drawn deeper into the legacy her grandfather had left for her. A legacy written in secrecy, fear, and a truth so heavy it had taken him a lifetime to bury. Emily did not return to the motel that night with the same certainty she'd had the day before. Something in her had changed, subtly but irrevocably. After she crawled out of that narrow passageway behind the cabinet, after she touched the journals, after she saw her own name written in her grandfather's cramped, fading script, it was not a simple discovery. It was a shift, a tilt in the axis of her life. She had gone to the estate thinking she would evaluate an old house, decide what to restore and what to sell, and move on. Instead, she had stepped into a story decades in the making, one that demanded more from her than she'd ever expected to give. The truth she had uncovered that afternoon had followed her into her dreams, tearing through the thin veil of sleep with images that did not belong to her memories. She saw streets at night, lit by the yellow glow of lamps, where men whispered together in shadows. She saw a familiar pair of hands writing urgently across pages. She heard the echoing thud of a door closing behind someone who never returned. She woke up to the sound of her own breath caught in her throat, sweat cooling on her skin, the motel room dark and heavy around her. She climbed out of bed before sunrise, unable to lie still any longer. The thought of the hidden chamber pulled at her, stronger than any fear she felt. She needed to go back. She needed to understand. But now the darkness felt like a presence, not an absence. Like the estate was awake, watching her, waiting for her return. She dressed quickly, drank cold coffee from the day before, and left the motel with a sense of stepping into something she could no longer avoid. When she arrived at the estate, the sky was a patchwork of deep blues and grays, the sun not yet fully risen. The house stood in silhouette, tall and unmoving, its windows black like unblinking eyes. Emily's tires crunched over gravel as she drove toward the front steps, and even before she turned off the engine, she spotted something that sent a cold rush down her arms. The gate, locked securely when she left, was slightly ajar. Not wide enough for a car to pass through, but open far enough that she knew it hadn't been an accident, and certainly not the wind. She stepped out of the car, keys clutched tightly in her hand. The air was colder than the hour warranted, a sharp chill that cut through her jacket. She walked back to the gate, touched the iron, felt the dampness of morning dew mixed with something else, an oily smear that hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had touched the gate recently. Someone had come in, or had tried to. She turned slowly in place, scanning the tree line. The forest was dense, the trunks rising like dark pillars, the underbrush thick. Nothing moved, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the prickling at the base of her neck sharpening into a thin, cold thread that ran down her spine. She closed the gate carefully and locked it again with the old iron key. This time she tugged on it twice, to be sure it would not open without force. Inside the house, the silence felt heavier. Dust hung in the beams of light that filtered weakly through the tall windows of the great hall. The cabinet stood exactly where she had left it, its drawers still ajar, its presence filling the room the way a sentinel might guard a threshold. Emily approached it slowly, half expecting something to have changed overnight. But the cabinet itself remained still and silent. Only the air around it felt different, charged somehow, like the moment before a storm. She knelt again before the hollowed cavity where the false panel had been, shining her flashlight into the broken wall. The jagged edges of bricks jutted out like teeth, and the narrow passage yawned beyond them, waiting for her. She slipped inside carefully, the chill of the confined space settling against her skin as she crawled forward. When she reached the wooden door of the chamber and pushed it open, the stale air greeted her with the same metallic tang. Everything inside the room was exactly as she had left it. The journal on the table lay open to the page where her name appeared. The lamp remained dark, and the dust-covered shelves waited beneath the same muted light of her flashlight. But now that she saw the room with clearer eyes, the overwhelming volume of information struck her differently. Each box, each notebook, each folded letter represented a thread in a tapestry her grandfather had woven in fear and urgency. And those threads, she sensed, did not end with him. They stretched into the present, into her life, into the world outside that house. She picked up the journal again, her hand steadier this time, even as her heart thrummed in her chest. She read deeper into her grandfather's entries, tracing the narrative of a city rotting beneath the veneer of respectability. He wrote of deals brokered behind closed doors, of city officials accepting bribes to bury investigations, of families who had built their fortunes on intimidation, coercion, and the elimination of those who threatened their status. Some entries were detailed accounts, times, dates, locations, while others were frantic, barely legible scribbles written at slanted angles across the pages, the handwriting trembling as though he had been writing in fear of being discovered. One passage described a night when he had seen men standing near the edge of the property, their car lights off, their silhouettes framed by moonlight. Another spoke of hearing footsteps outside his study window at 3 a.m. Boy. Yet another detailed a conversation he had overheard between 2 city officials who had come to the house under the pretense of discussing land use, only to speak in hushed tones about removing obstacles and keeping quiet those who know too much. Emily felt her pulse thudding louder with every paragraph. Her grandfather had uncovered a network of corruption that spanned decades, reaching into corners of the city she had never thought to question. It was not simply isolated wrongdoing. It was a system, maintained deliberately, stretching from banks to courtrooms to the highest offices. Those whose names appeared repeatedly in the journals were the same names she saw engraved on public buildings, memorial plaques, and philanthropic foundations. They were the families who shaped Ashford Hill's public image, who donated to schools, funded parks, and sponsored charity events. And yet beneath that carefully crafted facade lay something rotten. The deeper she read, the heavier the air inside the room felt. Her flashlight cast long shadows on the walls, making objects in her peripheral vision seem to shift. She forced herself to breathe steadily. The sense of being closed in, of being down in a pocket of buried truth, felt stronger now than ever. She understood, in a visceral way, why her grandfather had hidden the room. The evidence inside was enough to destroy reputations, careers, maybe even families. If exposed, it would unravel everything those powerful men and women had built. It would also place a target on the back of whoever revealed it. For a moment, Emily pressed the journal against her chest, her breath shallow. What was she supposed to do with all of this? How could she possibly shoulder the burden her grandfather had left? He had believed she would know how to act, but she felt anything but prepared. She was not an investigator, not a reporter, not someone familiar with exposing injustices. She was an ordinary woman with an ordinary life, a woman who paid her bills on time, scheduled her car maintenance, and planned vacations months in advance. How could she confront something that had frightened a man like Robert Harris into sealing himself in secrecy? Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a door closing somewhere in the house. The noise was faint, but unmistakable. Emily froze, gripping the edge of the table. She held her breath, waiting. After several heartbeats, she heard nothing more. But the silence now felt sharp, unnatural. The sound could have been the wind or the old house settling, but it had not sounded like that. It had sounded deliberate. Emily stepped back from the table, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She swallowed and forced herself to move, to return to the passage before panic closed around her. The chamber felt suddenly smaller, like the walls were inching inward. She slipped through the entrance and emerged into the great hall, her breath uneven. The air outside felt thinner, easier to inhale, but the dread lingered. She scanned the room. Nothing looked disturbed. The cabinet stood unmoving, and the hall was exactly as quiet as when she had entered. But the sense of being observed clung stubbornly to her. It was too early for the workers to have arrived. She had been alone when she came in. She would have heard a truck on the gravel, footsteps on the porch, voices in the hall. She took a slow step forward, then another, listening for any shift in the air. Her footsteps echoed faintly. As she neared the front door, she saw that the latch was still in place. The door had not opened. And yet she could not shake the memory of the sound. Soft but distinct, the thud of wood against wood from somewhere not far away. The day passed in a haze of unease. The workers arrived an hour later, busying themselves with repairs, their presence both comforting and intrusive. They noticed her pale expression but said nothing. The one man gave her a look that suggested he was fighting the urge to ask if she was all right. She forced herself to act normal, to delegate tasks, to keep the secrets of the hidden chamber tucked behind calm words. But she saw the way the men avoided the cabinet, the way they kept glancing toward the hall where she had emerged earlier, the way one of them startled when a tool clattered to the floor. Their fear of the cabinet no longer seemed superstitious. It felt rooted in something they sensed but could not articulate. By late afternoon, when the sun dipped toward the tree line and the workers prepared to leave, Emily walked outside to see them off. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, as the last truck rumbled down the driveway. When the dust settled and the sound faded, the estate felt immeasurably larger, quieter, emptier. The cold breeze picked up, rustling the branches overhead. Then she saw it. At the far end of the driveway, partly hidden by the curve of the trees, a dark sedan sat idling. Its windows were deeply tinted, its engine a low rumble barely audible over the wind. Emily stared at it, her heart beginning to race. She could not see who was inside, but she knew instinctively that the car had not been parked there by accident. It did not pull away immediately. Instead, it sat, half-hidden, like a predator watching from the shadows of the forest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car rolled backward, slowly, deliberately, disappearing around the bend and out of sight. Emily stood motionless long after it had gone, trying to steady her breathing. She understood the message. Someone knew she was here again. Someone was watching the house, and the secrets her grandfather had buried were no longer safely contained behind brick and dust. They had already begun to bleed into the world outside, attracting attention from those who wished them to stay hidden forever. The motel felt different that night. She double-checked the lock 3 times before turning off the lamp. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling every creak of the building as though it echoed from the estate. When she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, the dark sedan followed her into her dreams, idling at the edge of her consciousness, headlights dimmed, waiting for an opening. The next morning, she returned to the estate with a new resolve, walking straight into the great hall, as if pulled by an invisible thread. The house no longer felt like a place she had inherited. It felt like a place that had chosen her, drawing her deeper into her grandfather's unfinished story. She found herself returning to the hidden room again and again throughout the day, reading more entries, memorizing more names, piecing together the puzzle that had consumed her grandfather. Every hour she spent inside that chamber sharpened her sense of danger and heightened her awareness. She noticed small things she had not noticed before: the faint sound of gravel shifting outside, the subtle echo of footsteps on the porch, the way the wind seemed to quiet just before she heard something move. She could no longer tell which sounds belonged to her imagination and which belonged to those who watched. At times, she paced the room anxiously, torn between wanting to gather everything and flee, and wanting to uncover every last truth before fear silenced her. She knew that destroying the journals would free her from danger. She could burn them, leave the house, return to her old life, and pretend none of this had happened. She imagined the flames curling up the pages, the ink twisting into black smoke, the secrets dissolving into air. She could walk away. But every time she considered it, she saw the line her grandfather had written: "If something happens to me, the truth must survive." She could not bring herself to betray that plea, even as the weight of it pressed harder against her chest. The workers' discomfort deepened as the week progressed. They whispered among themselves when they thought she was out of earshot. She overheard phrases like, "That room, the noise again," and "Not right, not in that house." One man confronted her directly when no one else was present. "I don't know what you're doing here, ma'am," he said, his voice soft with worry. "But whatever you're digging up, leave it buried. That house, it's not empty." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't want to know what the workers sensed that she did not. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the estate grew dim, Emily prepared to leave. She walked through the great hall, past the cabinet, past the broken wall, past the secrets she had begun to unravel. When she reached the door of the guest house, where she kept her things during the renovation, she saw it immediately. The doorknob had been turned, not forced, not broken, but moved. Someone had tested it. Her breath hitched. She took a step closer, then knelt, examining the metal. There were faint smudges on the surface, darker than fingerprints should be. The gravel outside bore the unmistakable imprint of a shoe, small and partial, but real. Someone had walked up to the door in the middle of the night. Someone had reached for the knob. Someone had stood inches from where she slept. Panic surged through her, rising in her throat. She grabbed her phone and nearly called the police, but stopped herself. She could not be sure anyone would believe her, and more importantly, she could not be sure the police were uninvolved. Her grandfather's journals made one thing clear. Law enforcement had been compromised before. Perhaps it still was. She slept with the lights on that night, the guest house door locked, a chair pushed against the handle. Every time she drifted close to sleep, some sound, a distant branch snapping, the whisper of wind through the trees, brought her sharply awake again. The next morning, after barely 2 hours of rest, Emily stood in the middle of the great hall, dizzy with exhaustion, yet sharpened by a fierce, grim clarity. She could no longer remain passive. She could no longer confine herself to the shadows of the house's secrets. She needed help, not from those who were compromised, but from someone who had no allegiance to the city's elite. She recalled a name, a journalist she had read about years earlier, someone who had exposed corruption in another county, someone who had been threatened but had persisted. She dialed his number with trembling fingers. When he finally answered, his voice was low and guarded. "Mark Reynolds," he said. Emily swallowed hard. "My name is Emily Harris. I need to speak to you. It's about something my grandfather left behind. Something dangerous." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "How dangerous?" "Enough that someone came to my door last night," she whispered. Another pause. Then the journalist's tone shifted, quiet, focused. "Tell me where you are." Emily gave him the address. He arrived 2 hours later, his beat-up sedan rolling down the driveway with a cautious slowness. When he stepped out, he took in the house with a mix of curiosity and wariness, his eyes sweeping over the cracked steps, the towering facade, the trees curling around the property like protective arms. Inside the hall, his expression changed the moment he saw the cabinet. He approached it with a careful, deliberate step, as though sensing the gravity of what it concealed. Emily led him through the broken wall, down the narrow passage, and into the hidden chamber. When he saw the shelves of journals and boxes of documents, he went silent. "Good God," he whispered. If this is real." "It is," she said. "I've been reading them." He spent the next 2 hours examining the journals, photographing pages, taking notes so quickly his pen scratched at the edge of tearing paper. His hands trembled once or twice, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was holding. When he stood to face her, his expression had shifted completely. "Emily, this could change everything." She nodded slowly. "But it could also get someone killed." "Yes," he agreed. "It could." She offered him only part of the materials, her instincts pulling her back from trusting too freely. He accepted the partial archive with solemn understanding. He did not press her for more. When he left, there was a spark of something new in Emily's chest, a mixture of fear, resolve, and a distant sliver of hope. She had taken a step her grandfather had never dared, and now the truth had begun its slow unfurling into the world outside. But that night, as she returned to the guest house, she saw it again. The dark sedan. This time, it did not hide at the edge of the property. It sat boldly across the street, engine running, its shape barely distinguishable through the gathering darkness. When she stopped and looked directly at it, the car's headlights flicked on for a brief second. Not long, not bright, just a flash like a warning. Then the lights turned off again, and the car rolled backward into the shadows. Emily stood frozen, her breath shaking. The message was clear. She had begun something that could not be undone. And the people who wanted the past to stay buried had begun to take notice. Emily woke before dawn, though it hardly felt as if she had slept at all. The night had been an endless sequence of half-dreams and jarring moments of alertness, each one driven by the memory of headlights flickering briefly in the dark before disappearing behind the trees. She had lain awake long after that, staring at the thin curtains of the guest house as if expecting the silhouette of someone standing just beyond them. Even when the sky began to pale, she remained wrapped in the uneasy stillness that came with knowing she was no longer an observer in her grandfather's story. She was now a participant, and the world outside had shifted in response. When she stepped out onto the porch, the morning felt too calm, as though the estate itself was holding its breath. The gravel was damp with dew, and a faint mist clung to the forest in the distance, softening the outline of the trees. Nothing moved. No car waited beyond the gate. The silence felt almost deliberate. A retreat, not a disappearance. Whoever had been watching her had not gone far. They had simply changed tactics. The mansion loomed ahead of her, its windows reflecting the first thin lines of light. Emily walked toward it, her footsteps crunching softly in the silence. She hesitated on the threshold before pushing open the heavy door. The great hall felt colder than usual. Perhaps it was the early hour, or perhaps it was the absence of the workers, whose noise had at least offered a semblance of normality. Without them, the house felt stripped down to its bones, hollow and waiting. She stood for a long moment before the cabinet, staring at it as though it might shift again at any second. But the wood did not move. The shadows behind it did not breathe. She thought back to the moment she had found the hidden chamber, to the overwhelming mix of fear and awe. That sensation returned now with heavier weight. Today would not be about discovery. Today would be about consequences. Everything that had followed her meeting with the journalist, every lingering stare in town, every unexpected silence in the house, every rustle in the woods, told her that the truth was no longer contained within the estate's walls. It had begun to seep outward, reaching the world that her grandfather had tried and failed to confront alone. She turned away from the cabinet, intending to start the day by checking on the progress in the library, where a few workers were scheduled to repair a collapsed section of flooring. But when she entered the room, she found it empty. Their tools were gone. The ladders had been removed. A single drop cloth lay folded neatly on the floor as if packed in a hurry. She frowned. The workers never arrived this late. She pulled out her phone and checked the time. Nearly 8. They should have been here an hour ago. She went back outside, stepping into the cold air and listening. Only the distant buzz of insects greeted her. No engines, no voices, no familiar sound of tires on gravel. For a moment she wondered if they simply hadn't shown up. But then a darker possibility surfaced. What if they had chosen not to come back? The way they had spoken to her yesterday, the unease in their eyes, the murmured warnings, they had sensed something they did not want to be part of. Maybe they had decided the mansion held too many secrets for them to risk becoming collateral. She dialed the foreman's number. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. She tried another number, then another. All went unanswered. Fear prickled at the edges of her thoughts, but she tried to steady herself. There were more important things to worry about. Mark Reynolds, the journalist, had promised to contact her as soon as he had something concrete. He had left the estate yesterday with the quiet tension of a man who understood the scale of what he was carrying. If even a fraction of what was in the hidden room made it into the public eye, it would shake the city. But he had also warned her that exposure of this kind did not come without consequences, especially when aimed at people who had spent decades protecting their power. When her phone finally vibrated, the sound startled her. For a moment she simply stared at the screen, as though expecting it to spell out her fate. It was Mark. She answered quickly. "Hello?" His voice was low, breathless. "Emily, we need to meet." A chill rippled through her. "What happened?" Another breath. It started, not officially, Not publicly. But trust me, it started. She could hear something in his voice she had not expected. Fear mixed with exhilaration, the sound of someone standing on a trembling edge. Where are you? Ashford Hill Park, the far lot. I can't stay long. She didn't need to ask why. If someone had begun to follow her, someone would likely follow him too. I'll be there, she said. She drove with far more caution than usual, glancing repeatedly at her mirrors, expecting to see the dark sedan at any turn. But the roads remained empty. The city seemed oddly quiet, like a beast asleep with one eye just barely open. When she reached the park, Mark was waiting exactly where he'd said he would be, leaning against his car, a folder tucked tightly beneath his arm. He looked different. His usually composed demeanor stretched thin, the way a wire thins before it snaps, but his eyes still held that sharp, investigative spark. "Tell me," she said. He handed her the folder. Inside were printed screenshots, highlighted paragraphs, and copies of documents she recognized from the hidden chamber. "They're legitimate," he said. "I had them analyzed by someone I trust. Handwriting, ink age, paper fiber, carbon dating on a few pages. It all matches. Your grandfather kept immaculate records." Emily nodded, though her throat felt constricted. "I approached 2 editors," he continued. "One refused, said it was too big, too dangerous. The other said he'd need more evidence before any publication would touch it. But even that conversation..." He exhaled slowly. "I think someone overheard, or someone was alerted." "Why do you say that?" she asked. "Because when I got home last night, someone had gone through my mail slot. A note was on the floor. No signature. No message. Just a single sheet of paper with a printed sentence." He reached into his pocket and handed her a small folded page. Emily opened it. The words were simple, the font nondescript. "Some doors are sealed for a reason." Her pulse quickened. "They know you're involved." "They know both of us are," Mark said, "and they're not going to wait patiently to see what we do next." Emily looked down at the papers in the folder, the secrets her grandfather had preserved in darkness. "Do you think we can still expose them?" Mark hesitated. The pause was short, but powerful. "Yes," he said. "But we have to be smarter than they expect. The moment this becomes public, everything changes." They stood in silence for a moment, the cold morning air rising around them. "What do we do next?" she finally asked. "I'll keep pushing," he said. "But Emily, listen to me carefully. You should not stay at that estate alone." "I'm not leaving," she answered. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. "Then be careful. Lock every door. Don't ignore anything you hear. And Emily, don't go into that room unless you absolutely have to. They know it exists. They may try to get inside." Her breath caught. "You think they'll come for the documents?" He nodded. "Absolutely. And they won't knock." A chill passed through her that even the morning sun could not soften. They parted quietly, and Emily returned to the estate with a weight heavier than any she had carried so far. The house seemed to loom higher now, casting shadows that stretched long across the driveway. She unlocked the door and stepped into the hall, her movements measured, her senses sharpened. She went straight to the hidden room, slipping inside the narrow passage, clutching a lantern and a stack of freshly charged batteries. Inside the chamber, she checked the shelves, her fingers brushing the spines of her grandfather's journals. Nothing was missing. Yet the air felt disturbed, as if someone had been in the room. She told herself it was imagination, but even imagination had limits. Hours passed as she fortified the entry from the great hall. She moved the cabinet more tightly against the wall, secured the loose panel, and pushed heavy furniture in front of the opening. She could not hide the truth forever, but she could at least slow down anyone who tried to reach it before she was ready. By early afternoon, her nerves were stretched taut. She stepped outside to clear her head, breathing deeply, trying to quiet the tremors in her hands. A breeze swept across the lawn, rustling the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of pine. Then she heard the sound she feared most. An engine. Slow. Deliberate. She turned toward the gate. A dark shape appeared between the trees, gliding up the road with a predatory calm. The same sedan from before. This time, it did not idle at a distance. It pulled up directly in front of the gate and stopped, its engine rumbling in the afternoon stillness. Emily felt every muscle in her body tighten. No one stepped out at first. The tinted windows remained opaque. Her heart pounded in her throat as she stood there, exposed on the wide lawn. Then the driver's door opened. A tall man in a dark coat stepped out, closing the door with a soft click. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't move quickly. He simply stood behind the bars of the gate, looking at her with the unsettling stillness of someone who knew exactly how much fear he could inspire without speaking a word. "Miss Harris," he said finally, his voice smooth and disturbingly cordial. "We need to talk." She said nothing. "You've come across some things that don't belong to you." She remained frozen, her breath shallow. "I think you understand," he continued, "how unfortunate it would be if those things were to circulate." Emily tightened her grip on her phone, her fingers trembling. The man stepped closer to the gate, placing his hand on the iron bars. "Your grandfather made a mistake, Miss Harris. Don't repeat it." Something inside her flared. Fear, anger, resolve, all tangled together. She straightened her spine. "You should leave," she said, her voice shaky but clear. A slow smile formed on his lips. "For now." He stepped back into the car. The engine revved softly. The sedan reversed down the driveway, disappearing around the bend as quietly as it had come. Emily stood rooted to the spot long after the car vanished. The line had been crossed. They were no longer watching. They were warning. She moved quickly after that, her thoughts racing. She needed backup. She needed allies. She needed something no one could silence. When the sun had barely dipped below the tree line, her phone buzzed again. It was Mark. "They did something," he said. "Something big. Turn on the news." Her heart tripped. She rushed into the guest house and flicked on the small television mounted on the wall. The local news channel flickered into view. At first, the anchors looked composed, their voices calm, but then she saw it. Headlines running across the bottom of the screen. Breaking investigation into historic corruption. Allegations. Anonymous archive raises questions about city officials, authorities. Quietly reviewing newly surfaced documents. Emily clutched the edge of the table. The story was out. Not fully, not explosively, but enough. Enough to cause ripples. Enough to unsettle the powerful. Enough to shift the balance. Yet the fear did not recede. It intensified. That night, she barely slept. The hours crept by with the slow passage of clouds across the moonlit sky. At one point, she heard footsteps on the gravel again, so soft she might have imagined them. She held her breath for several minutes, listening, until silence swallowed the sound. By morning, she knew she could no longer stay in hiding. She had begun the work. She would finish it. The truth her grandfather protected deserved nothing less. The next few days unfolded like a storm gathering momentum. Journalists reached out to Mark. Investigators began quietly pulling city records. Rumors circulated among officials, whispers that spread faster than facts. A few smaller news outlets began releasing cautious articles. The city was no longer sleeping. It was waking up, slowly, groaning beneath the pressure of its own buried history. Emily spent her days in the hidden chamber, reviewing every remaining document, cataloging them with careful notes. At night, she slept only in brief snatches, fear keeping her senses sharpened. Twice she heard the sedan near the property. Once she saw its headlights flash through the trees, but each time it left without confrontation. Perhaps they were waiting, watching, calculating. When the police finally arrived at the estate, 3 patrol cars and 2 unmarked government vehicles, Emily felt her stomach knot. She stepped onto the porch as the officers approached, one of them holding up a badge. "Ms. Harris," he said, "we're here on behalf of the county. We need to collect some materials." Her breath tightened. "On what grounds?" "There's an active investigation," he replied. "We have the right to obtain any documents relevant to the city's history of official misconduct." He held out a letter, official, stamped, and signed. For a moment, panic clawed at her ribs. If the police took everything now, it could disappear again. Buried. Destroyed. Her grandfather's work lost. But then she remembered Mark's warning. Not everyone in law enforcement was compromised now. Times had changed. People had changed. There were still pockets of corruption. But there were also people willing to push back. And some of the articles released had named individuals so powerful that the authorities could no longer ignore the storm. She stepped aside and led them into the house. They worked for hours, documenting every journal, photographing every letter, scanning each page before placing it into sealed evidence boxes. 2 officers carried out old photographs, 3-box bundles of correspondence, and several binders of newspaper clippings. The shelves grew bare as the chamber slowly emptied, and with each item removed, Emily felt a mixture of fear and relief. The truth was leaving the shadows. It was stepping into institutions where it might finally be heard. When the last box was sealed, an officer approached her with a clipboard. "Ms. Harris, we'll need you to come down to the precinct tomorrow to give a formal statement." "I'll be there," she said. He nodded, then paused as though considering his words carefully. "You're aware that some people will not appreciate what's coming next." "I know," she replied quietly. "Be careful." She nodded again. When the officers left, and the sound of their engines faded down the driveway, the house felt empty, in a way Emily had never experienced. The hidden room, once heavy with danger, now felt strangely light. The weight of her grandfather's secrets had been carried out in cardboard boxes, taken into a world that would decide their fate. Emily walked into the chamber one last time, touching the shelves that now sat bare and quiet, no longer burdened by decades of truth. For a moment she thought she heard her grandfather's voice, a memory, a whisper, a soft echo of gratitude. She stood still, listening, until the feeling passed. The crisis did not end that day. It unfolded slowly, over weeks and months, ripple by ripple. Investigations opened. Officials were questioned. News outlets dug deeper. Some of the names in the journals fought back through legal channels. Others resigned quietly, hoping to slip away from public scrutiny. A few were arrested. Emily's life changed, too. She testified. She met with investigators. She answered calls from reporters, though she offered no interviews. She repaired the estate slowly, cautiously, transforming it from a site of isolation into something livable. The cabinet remained, but now it was merely furniture, stripped of its role as gatekeeper. The dark sedan never returned. Neither did the man behind the gate. One morning, months later, Emily stood in the garden beneath a warm spring sun. She held a small plaque in her hands, nothing ornate, simply engraved with words that had come to her in a dream, for the truth kept in darkness, for the courage that brought it to light. She placed it at the base of an old tree that had stood on the property long before she had been born. The earth smelled rich beneath her fingers as she set the plaque firmly into place. When she stepped back, the wind brushed gently against her hair, the branches swaying above her. For the first time in a long time, the estate did not feel hostile. It felt watchful. Yes, but not with malice. It felt like a house that had carried a burden for too many years and had finally been allowed to exhale. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows crept across the lawn, Emily walked into the great hall. The cabinet stood quiet, its wood catching the last golden light. She placed a hand on its surface, not with fear, but with understanding. Her grandfather had entrusted her with something immense. She had carried it forward, and now the house could rest. Outside, the night stirred softly, gentle and calm. Emily closed the front door behind her and stepped into whatever life waited ahead, no longer haunted by secrets, but strengthened by the truth she had chosen to reveal. The legacy was no longer hidden. It lived in the world now, and it belonged to everyone. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Watch the videos on your screen to see what happened in the others. And share this one so more people can see the truth.